Okay, because I was asked, here's an analysis of the timelines and temporal contingency. It goes without saying that this is 100% spoilers. Careful application of logic could even spoil future elements, and because I'm going to be explaining those things, you don't even have to think. You'll just get those spoilers. So watch at your own risk. This is all spoilers. Okay, so if you're still here, here's how it breaks down. We're going to split history into 3 periods. You can see them on your screen now. Past is represented in black. This is stuff that happens decades prior to the events of Bypass Gemini and the subsequent books which you have read. Present is represented by gray. This indicates events beginning with Bypass Gemini and continuing for about 5 or 10 years. Future is represented by white, and this includes events taking place several decades after the present. There are only 2 timelines in this setting. Technically 3, we can discuss that later, but only 2 of them really matter. The prime timeline, represented here by the upper section, is what really happened, from the point of view of Lex and the other characters as we've come to know them. The bad timeline is the version of where things don't go according to plan. The story begins with Ma discovering, thanks to information from the Vector Corp security head, that a massive cluster of GenMechs is growing somewhere far away from the developed part of the galaxy. As these robots cannot realistically be defeated as they exist now, they must be sabotaged in the past and thus rendered vulnerable to modern attack. And thus, Lex makes his first jump to the past. Of course, Lex doesn't arrive in the past. His failure to arrive in the past is the first step in the bad timeline. Because he has not arrived, his mission to sabotage the GenMechs fails. This means that when the present rolls around, the robots attack and society crumbles, because they cannot be defeated. For better or for worse, the Carter of this timeline figures out what went wrong and leaves for the past. He arrives prior to the point in the past that Lex failed to arrive, and thus this places him back before the original branching point and thus in the primary timeline. Meanwhile, things continue to go wrong in the bad timeline. After the fall of most of society, major events include the death of future Michelle. This will delight the unusually large contingent of fans that dislike her. Also, Ma creates her Ziva personality, and she also calculates where and when Lex will actually arrive, and leaves a case that will lead him back to her. Eventually, Lex does arrive, and at this point, much is explained, and he jumps back. He arrives in the past where he was supposed to go the first time. However, bad future Carter intercepts him, and it is determined that the plan, as it was conceived, cannot succeed. They must modify it, and to do that, both bad future Carter and Lex encounter past Carter. Eventually, they get around to their mission and try to sabotage the GenMechs. Failure here, by the way, will return history to the bad timeline, as sabotage will fail and all of those red things come to pass. At this point, it is arguably worth adding a third timeline identical to the bad timeline, except Lex does not appear in the future, as the version of him that did that has already done so in the bad timeline and failed. But as that doesn't happen, we're not going to go into it because it'll just complicate things that are already way too complicated. At this point, it becomes clear they will not succeed in sabotaging the GenMechs, or at least, realistically, they can't even get to where they will succeed without help. So Ma resolves to, upon successful completion of the mission, design a superior ship and launch a supplementary mission. To achieve this, a successful Lex will be frozen. He will then be thawed out, he will be sent back in time, and arrive just before they need him. But none of those things have happened yet. At this point, they finally succeed, and Lex is frozen. He is thus thawed out in the primary timeline, now with the robot sabotaged. This is where the story ends, so it's worth pointing out a few things. First, the prime timeline here is defined as the course of events where all of the white text already happened. As the story begins, and thus the previous 3 stories happened, we are in a world where the GenMechs are already sabotaged, and the whole of the story that we've just read was just to ensure that it already happened. It also means that, through the entire series so far, even before his ill-fated delivery took him to Big Sigma in the first place, Lex was already there, frozen in the Southern Hemisphere as part of the previously established Temporal Contingency protocols in his beta tester's contract. Except, if you think about it, even though this is where the story ended, there are a few things that have to happen in order for history to play out correctly. At some point, reasonably soon, Lex has to go back a second time, this time with a better ship. at which point he can arrive like he already did. Then, after his older instance leaves, he'll have to be refrozen as well. And then he can finally be rethawed in the future. Well, the present. Therefore, again, even before he shows up and crashes on Big Sigma in Bypass Gemini, there are already 2 time-displaced versions of him frozen and waiting to be thawed at the appropriate time. Not only that, there's also a squee with a somewhat more advanced Ma loaded into her noggin with them. When do we get to see this other mission, the one where he goes back with the better ship? We've only seen the end of that. Well, I didn't write that yet, but I'll probably get around to it one of these days, so stay tuned. Until then, I hope this helped clear some things up.